Imagine waking up in a stranger's shirt, in a world of luxury that feels more like a cage, with a letter that unravels secrets you never knew existed. What would you do to protect the ones you love? If you're ready for a journey of sacrifice, redemption, and a love that grows in the most unexpected places, hit that like button to let us know you're with us, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you won't miss a single moment of this heartfelt story. Let's dive in together. I woke to a shiver, the kind that creeps down your spine and settles in your bones. The air was heavy with the scent of sandalwood, a scent that wasn't mine. My eyes adjusted to the dim glow of a crystal chandelier above, its light casting fractured shadows on the cold marble floor beneath my bare feet. I glanced down, my breath catching in my throat. I was wearing a white dress shirt, too large for me, the sleeves slipping over my hands. The fabric clung to my skin, carrying a faint trace of coffee, sharp and bitter, like the man it belonged to. This was his shirt, Damian Blackwood's. The man my brother had handed me over to, like I was nothing more than a bargaining chip to settle a debt. I was Emily Harper, 24 years old, a small-town baker who had never known love. I should have been in my tiny shop on the outskirts of New York, kneading dough, the smell of yeast and flour wrapping around me like a warm embrace. Instead, I was here, trapped in this opulent room that felt more like a prison than a palace. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights twinkled, a cruel reminder of how far I was from home. My heart pounded, fear rising like a tide I couldn't hold back. How had I ended up here, in this gilded cage, wearing nothing but his shirt? The memory of last night flooded back, sharp and painful. My brother James had driven me here in a sleek black car, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. I'd sat in the back seat, tears streaming down my face, my simple cotton dress wrinkled from the long ride. "Bear it, Emily," he'd said, his voice breaking. "You're our only hope." Our mother, Margaret, lay in a hospital bed, her heart failing her, the machines beeping a grim rhythm I couldn't escape. James had racked up millions in debt after a failed business venture, and now our family was on the brink of ruin. I'd agreed to this deal to save her, to save us, but the weight of it crushed me. Somewhere along the way, exhaustion had overtaken me, and I'd passed out, only to wake in this unfamiliar place. My own clothes gone, replaced by Damian's shirt. I stood, my legs trembling, the marble floor biting into my soles. My fingers instinctively reached for the silver ring hanging on a chain around my neck, a keepsake from my mother, the one thing grounding me in this moment. I closed my eyes, and for a fleeting second, I was back in our tiny kitchen, the one in our old house before everything fell apart. I could hear her soft voice, humming a lullaby as she stirred a pot of soup, the scent of freshly baked bread filling the air. Her laughter had been a melody then, her hands warm and steady as she taught me how to knead dough, her apron dusted with flour. "You'll always be my little baker," she'd say, her hazel eyes, my eyes, crinkling at the corners. That memory was a lifeline, a flicker of warmth in the cold reality I now faced. But the warmth vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by a hollow ache. I was no longer that little girl, safe in my mother's kitchen. I was a pawn in a game I didn't understand, a game orchestrated by a man I'd never met. Damian Blackwood, 38 years old, a billionaire real estate mogul who held my family's future in his hands. I didn't know what he wanted from me, but the thought of facing him made my stomach churn. I clutched the ring tighter, the metal digging, into my palm, a silent plea for strength. As I moved to the edge of the bed, something slipped from the pocket of my coat, draped over a chair nearby. A folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges, fluttered to the floor. I bent to pick it up, my fingers trembling as I unfolded it. The handwriting was my mother's, shaky and uneven, as if written in a rush. "Emily," it began. If you read this, please forgive your father. He sacrificed more than you know." The words hit me like a punch to the chest. Forgive him? My father had disappeared years ago, leaving us to fend for ourselves. Or so I'd thought. I'd blamed him for our struggles, for the lines of worry, etched into my mother's face, for the debt that had brought me here. What did she mean, he'd sacrificed more? What secrets had he kept? I sank onto the edge of the bed, the letter still in my hand, my mind racing. The room around me seemed to close in, the chandelier's light dimming as if it too held its breath. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew this was only the beginning. The weight of my mother's words, the scent of sandalwood lingering on Damien's shirt, the cold marble beneath my feet. They were all pieces of a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. But for my mother, for the family I'd left behind, I had to try. I had to face whatever came next, even if it meant confronting the man who now held my fate in his hands. The days that followed my arrival at Damien Blackwood's penthouse were a blur of silence, heavy and suffocating, like a fog. I couldn't escape. Every morning, the scent of sandalwood drifted from his office down the hall, a reminder of the man who now held my life in his hands. I felt like a bird in a gilded cage, my wings clipped by a deal I hadn't chosen. The marble floors echoed. With my hesitant steps, the walls lined with modern art that seemed to watch me, their abstract shapes cold and unfeeling. I was a stranger in this world of luxury, a baker from a small town who longed for the warmth of my oven, the laughter of my customers, the simplicity of a life I'd left behind. Damien was rarely around, his presence marked only by the faint sound of his footsteps when he returned late at night, or the occasional glimpse of him in a tailored suit, his gray eyes sharp and unreadable. The few times we crossed paths, the air between us crackled with tension. One evening, as I sat at the long dining table, staring at a plate of food I couldn't bring myself to eat, he appeared in the doorway. "Join me for dinner," he said, his voice low, more a command than an invitation. I shook my head, my throat tight, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm not hungry." He stared at me for a moment, his gaze piercing, then turned and walked away without another word. The silence that followed was heavier than any rebuke. I hated how small he made me feel, how powerless. But more than that, I hated the part of me that wondered about him. Who was he beneath the icy facade? Why had he agreed to this deal? I pushed the thoughts away, focusing instead on the one thing that kept me grounded: my mother. Every afternoon, I was allowed to visit her at the hospital, a small mercy in this otherwise suffocating existence. I'd sit by her bedside, the sterile scent of antiseptic sharp in my nose, and gently wipe the sweat from her brow with a soft cloth. Her hand, frail and trembling, would find mine, her fingers curling around my own with a warmth that brought tears to my eyes. "You're my joy, Emily," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread, her hazel eyes, so like mine, filled with a love that hadn't dimmed despite her illness. As I held her hand, a memory flickered to life, as vivid as if it were happening right then. I was 8 years old, standing on a stool in our tiny kitchen, my hands dusted with flour as my mother taught me how to knead dough. The scent of yeast filled the air, mingling with the warmth of her laughter as she guided my small hands, showing me how to press and fold, her apron tied loosely around her waist. "Bread is love, Emily," she'd said, her voice soft as a lullaby. "You put your heart into it, and it'll always come back to you." I'd giggled then, flour smudged on my cheek, but now, sitting by her bedside, I clung to that memory like a lifeline. It was a reminder of who I was, of the life I'd had before this deal stole it away. But could I ever find that warmth again? That love, in a world so cold? The question haunted me, a quiet ache that followed me back to the penthouse each evening. I tried to keep my distance from Damien, to shield myself from the uncertainty he brought. But one day, something shifted. I was tidying the desk in the study, a habit born from my need to feel useful, when I found a folded piece of paper tucked inside a drawer. It was a hospital invoice, stamped paid, dated weeks before James had even approached Damien with the deal. My breath caught as I read the details. The bill was for my mother's treatment, every cent covered. The signature at the bottom unmistakably Damien's. My hands trembled as I held the paper, my mind racing. He'd paid for her care, before I'd even arrived, before I'd become a part of this arrangement. Why would he do that? What did it mean? I stood there, the invoice still in my hand. The sandalwood scent in the room suddenly sharper, more pronounced. My heart thudded, a mix of confusion and curiosity swirling within me. I'd thought Damien was a man of cold calculation, a billionaire, who saw me as nothing more than a transaction. But this quiet act of kindness, hidden away where I wasn't meant to find it, challenged everything I'd assumed. I glanced at the closed door of his office, imagining him behind it, his sharp jaw set, his gray eyes focused on some business matter. For the first time, I wondered if there was more to him than I'd allowed myself to see. The silver ring around. My neck felt heavier as I tucked the invoice back into the drawer, my fingers lingering on the paper for a moment longer. I didn't know what to make of this discovery, but it stirred something in me, a flicker of hope, or perhaps a question I wasn't ready to answer. As I left the study, the city lights glimmering through the windows, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the edge of something I didn't yet understand, a journey that would change me in ways I couldn't yet imagine. The hospital invoice I'd found in Damien's drawer haunted me, its implications swirling in my mind like leaves caught in a restless wind. Why had he paid for my mother's care before I'd even arrived? The question gnawed at me, but I wasn't ready to confront him. Not yet. Instead, I sought solace where I always had. At my mother's bedside. Every afternoon, I'd sit with her, the sterile scent of antiseptic sharp in the air, the soft beep of the heart monitor, a constant reminder of her fragility. I'd hold her hand, her fingers frail and trembling in mine, and let her presence anchor me amidst the uncertainty of my new life. One afternoon, as golden sunlight filtered through the hospital window, casting a warm glow across the pale sheets, my mother's grip tightened around my hand. Her hazel eyes, so like mine, were clouded with exhaustion, but there was a determination in them I hadn't seen in weeks. "Emily," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread, "I need to tell you the truth." I leaned closer, my heart thudding, the air suddenly thick with anticipation. "Your father, he didn't abandon us," she said, her words slow, each one a weight I could feel in my chest. "He sold the last piece of our land to pay off debts, but he was betrayed. A man named Richard Steele, a former partner of Damien's, tricked him, took everything. Your father sacrificed it all for us." Her words hit me like a physical blow, my breath catching as her trembling fingers squeezed mine tighter, as if to steady me through the revelation. I'd spent years blaming my father, picturing him as a coward who'd fled when we needed him most. I'd seen the worry lines deepen on my mother's face, watched our small bakery struggle to stay afloat, and I'd hated him for it. But now, the truth shattered that image. He hadn't run. He'd fought for us, given up everything, only to be betrayed by a man whose name now tied him to Damien. The weight of my misunderstanding pressed down on me, a quiet ache spreading through my chest. I brushed a tear from my cheek, my mother's hand still in mine, her skin cool and papery against my own. I couldn't speak, couldn't find the words to respond, but the name Richard Steele echoed in my mind, a dark thread weaving through this tangled mess. What did Damien know about this man? How deep did their connection run? I stayed with my mother until she drifted into a fitful sleep, her breathing shallow but steady. As I kissed her forehead, the scent of her lavender hand cream, a scent that had always meant home, clung to me, a fleeting comfort in the storm of my thoughts. That evening, I returned to the penthouse, my mind still reeling. The city lights glittered beyond the windows, but they offered no answers. I found myself standing outside Damien's office, the faint aroma of coffee seeping through the door, rich and grounding. I didn't know what I'd say, but I couldn't wait any longer. I knocked softly, the sound barely audible, and when he called for me to enter, I stepped inside, my heart pounding. Damien sat behind a sleek mahogany desk, a stack of papers in front of him, his sharp jaw set in concentration. He looked up as I entered, his gray eyes meeting mine, and for a moment, the air between us felt charged, heavy with unspoken questions. I clutched the silver ring around my neck, the metal cool against my skin, and took a steadying breath. "Do you know Richard Steele?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my efforts to keep it steady. He froze, his pen stilling mid-signature, and in that moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes, a shadow of pain, raw and unguarded. It was the first time I'd seen him falter, the first crack in his icy facade. He set the pen down, his movements deliberate, and leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving mine. "Yes," he said finally, his voice low, almost a whisper, as if the name itself carried a weight he didn't want to bear. "I know him," I swallowed hard, the question burning on my tongue. "What does he have to do with my family?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Damien's expression softened, and for the first time, I saw something beyond the coldness. A quiet sorrow, a depth I hadn't expected. He stood, moving around the desk to stand closer, the scent of coffee and sandalwood stronger now, mingling with the warmth of his presence. "Steele is the reason I agreed to this deal," he said, his voice steady, but laced with something deeper, something that made my breath catch. "He's been after your family for years, using your brother's debt as leverage. I took you in to protect you, to protect them." His words hung in the air, heavy and unexpected, and I felt the ground shift beneath me. Protect us. I'd thought this arrangement was a transaction, a cold exchange to settle a debt. But now I saw it in a new light. Damien's gray eyes held mine, and in them, I saw a quiet sincerity, a concern he'd never spoken aloud. It wasn't just obligation. It was something more, something I couldn't yet name. My fingers tightened around the silver ring, my mother's words echoing in my mind. "He sacrificed more than you know, you." Maybe Damien had been sacrificing too, in ways I'd never imagined. As I stood there, the dim light of his office casting soft shadows around us, I felt a stirring in my chest, a flicker of connection, fragile but real. For the first time, I wondered if the man standing before me might be more than the cold billionaire I'd feared. And for the first time, I felt the faint stirrings of something I hadn't expected. Hope. The truth about my father lingered in my mind like the faint echo of a song I couldn't forget. He hadn't abandoned us. He'd sacrificed everything, only to be betrayed by Richard Steele, a name that now cast a shadow over my fragile hope. Knowing that Damien had stepped into this mess to protect us changed the way I saw him. The cold billionaire I'd feared was beginning to unravel, revealing a man who carried burdens I hadn't understood. But the weight of that truth also pressed me into action. I couldn't let my family remain a target for Steele's vendetta. I had to do something, anything, to protect them. I found my brother James early one morning, the city streets outside the penthouse shrouded in a soft gray mist. He was sitting on the steps of a small cafe near his apartment, his shoulders slumped, his hands rough and calloused from months of hard labor to pay off his debts. The sight of him, so worn and weary, stirred a mix of anger and pity in me. "James," I said, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed, and I saw the guilt etched into every line of his face. Before I could say more, he stood, his voice breaking as he spoke. "I'll fix this. Emily," he said, his hands trembling, "I swear I'll make it right." I nodded, my chest tight, and in that moment, I believed him. Not because of his words, but because of the raw determination in his eyes. A mirror of the brother I'd once known, the one who'd carried me on his shoulders through our childhood fields. But James wasn't the only one carrying a burden. Later that day, as I sorted through papers in the penthouse study, a habit to keep my hands busy, I found a letter from Damien's lawyer, tucked beneath a stack of contracts. The words on the page stopped me cold. Damien had abandoned a multi-million-dollar project, a deal that could have solidified his empire, to shield my family from Steele's threats. The letter detailed how Steele had leveraged James's debt to pressure Damien, threatening to ruin us if he didn't comply. Damien had chosen us over his ambition, a sacrifice he'd made in silence, never once seeking recognition. I stood there, the paper trembling in my hands, tears blurring my vision. The sandalwood scent in the room felt heavier now, a quiet testament to the man who'd given up so much for us. That evening, I visited my mother at the hospital, needing her presence to steady me. The small kitchenette in her ward was a far cry from the one we'd shared at home, but as I brewed chamomile tea, the familiar scent filled the air, wrapping me in memories of simpler times. I could almost see her standing in our old kitchen, her apron tied loosely, her laughter mingling with the aroma of herbs as she taught me how to steep tea just right. "It's all in the timing, Emily," she'd say, her voice a melody I'd never forget. I poured the tea into a cup, the steam rising in soft curls, and brought it to her bedside. She smiled weakly, her hand reaching for mine as I sat beside her. I wrapped my arms around her, feeling the frailness of her frame, the warmth of her embrace a balm to my aching heart. "I'll protect our family, Mama," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion, the scent of chamomile lingering between us. When I returned to the penthouse that night, the city lights casting a soft glow through the windows, Damien was waiting for me in the living room. He stood by the fireplace, the flickering flames casting shadows across his sharp features, his gray eyes softer than I'd ever seen them. I paused in the doorway, my breath catching as he turned to face me. The air between us felt different, now charged with an understanding that hadn't been there before. I thought of the letter, of his sacrifice, and my heart swelled with a gratitude I couldn't put into words. He stepped closer, the scent of coffee and sandalwood following him, and for a moment, we simply stood there, the silence speaking louder than any words could. Then he reached out, his hand brushing mine, his fingers warm and steady against my own. The touch was gentle, a quiet gesture that held more weight than any grand declaration. In his eyes I saw a tenderness I hadn't expected, a silent acknowledgement of the burdens we both carried. It wasn't a confession of love, not yet, but it was a promise, a vow that he was in this with me, for better or worse. I looked down at our joined hands, the silver ring around my neck catching the firelight, and felt a shift within me. The man I'd once feared was becoming something more, a partner, a protector, someone I could lean on in a world that felt so unsteady. James's promise to make things right, Damien's unspoken sacrifice, my mother's enduring love. They were threads weaving a tapestry of redemption, one I hadn't expected to find in this cold, opulent place. As the fire crackled softly, I held Damien's hand a little tighter, a small act of trust, a step toward something new. The days after I learned of Damien's sacrifice felt lighter, as if a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying had begun to lift. The penthouse, once a gilded cage, started to feel less like a prison and more like a place where I could breathe. My brother James threw himself into work, taking on extra shifts at a construction site, his hands growing rougher. With each passing day as he chipped away at the debt that had brought me here, I'd see him sometimes. His face lined with exhaustion but lit with a quiet determination, and I knew he meant it when he'd promised to make things right. His efforts were a balm to the wounds our family had carried for so long, a slow but steady step toward healing. Damien, too, had changed in ways I couldn't ignore. He wasn't the cold billionaire I'd first met, the man whose gray eyes had once seemed to pierce through me with indifference. He'd taken a stand against Richard Steele, using his influence to ensure the man's threats could no longer touch us. Steele had been a shadow over our lives, a reminder of betrayal and loss. But Damien's actions had pushed that shadow back, leaving room for light to creep in. I didn't know the details of how he'd done it, legal maneuvers, financial pressure, or something else entirely. But I felt the difference in the air, a sense of safety I hadn't known I'd been missing. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the New York skyline, painting the city in shades of gold and amber, I found myself in the penthouse kitchen with Damien and my mother. She'd been discharged from the hospital just days before, her health still fragile, but stable enough to join us for a few hours. The kitchen was a far cry from the one in our old home, with its sleek marble countertops and stainless steel appliances. But as I ground coffee beans, the rich, earthy aroma filled the air, wrapping me in a memory so vivid it brought a smile to my lips. I could see my mother in our old house, standing at the counter with a chipped ceramic mug, her hands steady as she poured hot water over the grounds, the scent of coffee mingling with her soft humming. "Nothing starts the day like a good cup," she'd say, her hazel eyes crinkling with warmth as she handed me a mug, too big for my small hands. Now, as I poured the coffee into 3 cups, the steam rising in delicate curls, I felt that same warmth. My mother sat at the counter, a shawl draped over her shoulders, her face pale but glowing with a quiet joy. Damien stood beside me, his presence steady and grounding, his sleeves rolled up as he helped me set out the cups. There was a softness to him I hadn't seen before, a gentleness in the way he moved, careful not to startle my mother with sudden gestures. He handed her a cup, his voice low and kind. "Careful. It's hot," he said. And she smiled, her eyes meeting his with a gratitude that mirrored my own. We sat together, the 3 of us, the sunset casting a golden glow through the windows, the city sprawling out below us like a canvas of light. My mother reached for my hand, her fingers still frail but warm, and then she reached for Damien's, her touch a bridge between us. "I'm so proud of you both," she said, her voice soft but steady, each word carrying the weight of her love. I felt tears prick my eyes, the kind that come from a happiness so deep it aches, and I squeezed her hand gently, the silver ring around my neck catching the fading light. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I leaned against Damien's shoulder, the fabric of his shirt soft against my cheek, his warmth seeping into me like a promise. I thought of the journey that had brought us here, the fear, the uncertainty, the sacrifices we'd all made. James, working tirelessly to redeem himself, his hands rough but his heart earnest. Damien, giving up a piece of his empire to shield us, his actions speaking louder than any words ever could. And my mother, whose love had held us together through it all, her strength a quiet force that had guided me even in my darkest moments. I looked out at the city, the lights beginning to twinkle as dusk settled in, and I realized I'd found something I hadn't expected. A love born not of grand gestures, but of quiet, steadfast devotion. Damien's arm shifted slightly, his hand resting lightly on my back. A gesture so simple yet so profound. It wasn't a declaration, not a sweeping romance, but it was real. A bond forged through shared burdens and unspoken promises. I thought of my father, of the sacrifices he'd made, and I felt a peace settle over me, a forgiveness I hadn't known I needed to give. The scent of coffee lingered in the air, mingling with the warmth of the moment, and I knew this was happiness. Not the fleeting kind, but the kind that sinks into your bones, the kind that lasts. My mother's hand in mine, Damien's steady presence beside me, the city stretching out before us. It was a tableau of love, of family, of redemption. As the last rays of sunlight faded, I closed my eyes, letting the warmth of this moment wrap around me. A quiet promise that we'd made it through the storm, together. The warmth of that sunset evening lingered in my heart, a fragile glow that I clung to in the days that followed. My mother's smile, Damien's steady presence, the scent of coffee wrapping us in a shared moment of peace. It had felt like a promise, a glimpse of the happiness we'd fought so hard for. But even as I savored that newfound light, a shadow crept back into our lives, a reminder that some battles weren't so easily won. Richard Steele, the man who'd betrayed my father and haunted my family for years, wasn't ready to let go. It was a crisp morning when I found the letter, slipped under the penthouse door like a venomous whisper. The envelope was plain, unmarked, but the weight of it in my hand sent a chill down my spine. I tore it open, my fingers trembling, and read the words scrawled in sharp, angular handwriting. "You think you're safe, Blackwood. I'll take everything you've built, and her family with it." The threat was clear, the malice dripping from every word, and I felt my stomach twist, the fragile peace I'd found shattering like glass. Richard Steele wasn't done with us. He'd lost his leverage when Damien protected my family, but his bitterness had festered, and now he was striking back. I stood in the foyer, the letter still in my hand, the cold marble floor biting into my bare feet. The city hummed beyond the windows, indifferent to the storm brewing in my heart. I thought of my mother, her frail frame finally beginning to heal, and James, working tirelessly to atone for his mistakes. I couldn't let Steele undo everything we'd fought for. I turned, my steps quickening as I sought out Damien, the scent of sandalwood guiding me to his office. He was there, standing by the window, his sharp profile softened by the morning light. "Damien," I said, my voice trembling. As I held out the letter, he took it from me, his gray eyes scanning the words, and I saw his jaw tighten, a flicker of anger passing over his features. But then he looked at me, and that anger softened into something else, resolve, steady and unyielding. He stepped closer, his hand finding mine, his fingers warm against my own. The touch was firm, grounding, a silent promise that he wouldn't let Steele win. "I won't let him touch Steele hurt you," he said, his voice low, the words a vow etched in stone. I felt the weight of his promise settle over me, a shield against the fear that had threatened to consume me. I nodded, my fingers tightening around his, the silver ring around my neck a quiet reminder of the family I was fighting for. But even as I drew strength from Damien's resolve, a new question tugged at my mind. Why was Steele so determined to destroy us? What drove his hatred? The question lingered as I moved through the day, my thoughts a tangled knot I couldn't unravel. That afternoon, while tidying the living room, I found a small wooden box on a shelf, its surface worn smooth by time. I opened it, expecting to find papers or trinkets, but instead, I discovered an old photograph, faded at the edges. It showed Damien as a young man, standing beside a woman who looked strikingly like my mother. Same hazel eyes, same gentle smile. My breath caught as I realized who she was. Damien's mother. The resemblance was uncanny, a mirror of the woman who'd raised me, who'd taught me how to bake and love with all my heart. On the back of the photo, in a delicate script, were the words, Margaret and I, 1985. I sat down heavily on the couch, the photograph trembling in my hands. The scent of sandalwood in the room suddenly sharper, more poignant. My mother and Damien's mother had known each other, had been friends, perhaps even confidants. The realization hit me like a wave, a thread of connection I'd never imagined. I thought of the stories my mother had told me, of a childhood, friend who'd shared her dreams, who'd laughed with her through the hard years. Could this be her? Had our families been intertwined long before James's death? Long before this deal that had brought Damien and me together? I ran my fingers over the photo, the edges soft under my touch, and felt a warmth bloom in my chest. It was as if fate had woven our lives together, a tapestry of shared history that stretched back decades. I thought of my mother's strength, of Damien's quiet sacrifices, and I realized that this connection was a gift, a bridge between our past and the future we were building. I stood, the photograph still in my hand, and felt a renewed sense of purpose. Steele's threats couldn't erase this bond, this history that tied us together. As I placed the photo back in the box, my fingers lingered on the worn wood, the warmth of that discovery settling into me like a quiet promise. We weren't just fighting for survival. We were fighting for a legacy, for the love that had bound our mothers together, and the love that was growing between us. Steele could try to tear us apart, but he wouldn't succeed, not as long as we stood together. Richard Steele's threat hung over us like a storm cloud, dark and unyielding. But Damien's resolve had given me a flicker of hope. The photograph I'd found, the one tying our mothers together, had woven a thread of connection between us, a quiet reminder that our bond was deeper than any deal, stronger than any enemy. Yet as the days passed, I could feel the tension building, a storm ready to break. Steele wasn't a man who made idle threats, and I knew he'd strike where it hurt most. What I didn't expect was the lengths Damien would go to protect us, the sacrifice that would change everything. It was late in the evening when I heard the news, the city outside the penthouse windows aglow with the soft hum of streetlights. I was in the living room, folding a shawl my mother had left behind during her last visit, the faint scent of her lavender hand cream clinging to the fabric. The door opened, and Damien stepped inside, his usually impeccable suit slightly rumpled, his sharp jaw set in a way that made my stomach twist. His gray eyes met mine, and in them, I saw a storm of emotions, resolve, exhaustion, and something softer, something that made my heart skip. "Emily," he said, his voice low, carrying a weight I hadn't heard before. I set the shawl down, my hands trembling as I crossed the room to meet him. Before I could ask what had happened, he reached for my hand, his fingers warm and steady against my own, the touch grounding me in the midst of my rising fear. "I've stepped down as CEO," he said, the words hitting me like a wave, heavy and unyielding. It was the only way to stop Steele. He was using my position to leverage his threats, against your family, against us. I couldn't let him win. I stared at him, my breath catching in my throat, the dim light of the room casting soft shadows across his face. Stepped down? Damien Blackwood, the man who'd built an empire from nothing, who'd once seemed untouchable, had given up everything. His title, his power, his legacy, to protect us. The magnitude of his sacrifice washed over me, and I felt tears prick my eyes, not from sadness, but from a gratitude so deep it ached. I thought of the invoice I'd found, the project he'd abandoned, the quiet ways he'd shielded us from harm. This was no longer just a deal to him. It was personal, a vow he'd made with his whole being. My hand tightened around his, the warmth of his touch a lifeline in the storm of my emotions. I stepped closer, my voice barely a whisper. "You gave up everything," I said, the words trembling as they left my lips. He shook his head, his thumb brushing lightly over my knuckles, a gesture so tender it stole my breath. His gray eyes held mine, and in them, I saw a vulnerability I'd never seen before, a softness that spoke of a man who'd finally let down his walls. "Not everything," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "I still have you." The words hung between us, a quiet confession that shifted the air around us. I felt my heart stutter, the walls I'd built around myself crumbling under the weight of his gaze. Without thinking, I closed the distance between us, wrapping my arms around him, my cheek pressing against his chest. The scent of sandalwood and coffee enveloped me, mingling with the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, a sound that anchored me in that moment. His arms came around me, strong and sure, and for the first time, I felt truly safe. Not just from steel, but from the fears that had haunted me since the day I'd arrived here. The dim light of the room seemed to glow warmer, the shadows softening as we stood there, holding each other in a silence that spoke louder than any words. But the redemption in that moment wasn't Damien's alone. The next day, James came to the penthouse. His work boots scuffed, his face lined with exhaustion but lit with a quiet pride. In his hands was a small envelope, the edges worn from being carried in his pocket. "I've paid off the last of the debt," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. He handed me the envelope, and I opened it to find a receipt, the final proof of his efforts to make things right. I looked up at him, my throat tight, and saw the remorse in his eyes, a silent apology for the pain he'd caused. "I'm sorry, Emily," he said, his gaze dropping to the floor, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his past mistakes. I stepped forward, placing the envelope on the table, and pulled him into a hug, feeling the roughness of his jacket against my cheek. "You've done enough," I whispered, my voice breaking as I held him tight. In his eyes, I saw the brother I'd always loved, the one who'd once carried me on his shoulders, now standing taller despite the scars of his journey. The scent of lavender from my mother's shawl still lingered in the air, a quiet reminder of the family we'd fought to protect, the family we'd rebuilt together. As James left, I turned to Damien, who'd been watching from the doorway, his expression soft with understanding. The city lights glittered beyond the windows, a canvas of hope against the fading day. I thought of my mother, of the photograph that had tied our families together. And I knew that this moment, this quiet redemption, was the culmination of all our sacrifices. We'd faced the shadows and come through stronger, bound by a love that had grown in the unlikeliest of places. The morning sun filtered through the penthouse windows, casting a soft golden glow across the kitchen, where the scent of freshly baked bread filled the air. I stood at the counter, my hands dusted with flour, kneading dough with a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat, steady and comforting. My mother sat nearby, her shawl draped over her shoulders, her hazel eyes bright with a joy I hadn't seen in years. Damien was beside me, his sleeves rolled up, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his lips as he watched me work. The kitchen, once a cold expanse of marble and steel, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where the past and present wove together in perfect harmony. I'd woken early, a quiet urge stirring in me to bake, to bring a piece of my old life into this new one. As the dough rose, the scent of yeast and warmth enveloped us, pulling me back to memories of our tiny kitchen in the house I'd grown up in. I could see my mother there, her apron tied loosely, her hands guiding mine as we shaped loaves together, the air filled with her soft humming and the promise of a fresh batch. "Bread is love, Emily," she'd said, her voice a melody that had carried me through my childhood. Now, as I slid the loaf into the oven, I felt that love again, a thread that had never broken, no matter how far I'd come. My mother reached for my hand, her fingers still frail but warm, and I saw the gratitude in her eyes, a silent thank you for the journey we'd shared. "You've made me so happy," she said, her voice soft but steady, each word a gift. I squeezed her hand, the silver ring around my neck catching the light, a quiet reminder of the family we'd fought to protect. Damien's hand brushed mine as he set a tray of butter and jam on the counter, his touch gentle, a silent promise that he was here, that he'd always be here. I looked at him, his gray eyes softer now, the sharp edges of the man I'd once feared smoothed by the love we'd built together. We sat at the counter, the three of us, the bread warm and golden between us, its crust crackling softly as I broke it apart. The scent of yeast mingled with the morning air, a comfort that wrapped around us like a quilt. I spread butter on a piece for my mother, watching as she took a small bite, her smile widening with each taste. Damien took a piece too, his fingers brushing mine again, and I felt a warmth bloom in my chest, a happiness so deep it felt eternal. This was what I'd fought for. Not just survival, but moments like this, where love and family filled the spaces that fear had once occupied. I leaned against Damien's shoulder, the fabric of his shirt soft against my cheek, his warmth seeping into me like a promise kept. I thought of the journey that had brought us here, the fear of that first morning, waking in his shirt, the cold distance between us, the secrets that had unraveled like threads. I thought of James, his hands rough, but his heart earnest, working to redeem himself, his debt finally paid. I thought of my father, the man I'd misunderstood for so long, whose sacrifices had paved the way for our survival. And I thought of our mothers, their friendship a hidden thread that had bound our families together, a legacy of love that had guided us even when we didn't know it. The city hummed beyond the windows, a symphony of life that felt distant, unimportant, compared to the quiet joy of this moment. I reached for a piece of paper and a pen, the urge to capture this feeling too strong to ignore. I wrote in a simple, steady hand, "We will always protect each other." I folded the note and placed it on the counter, a small promise to the future, a vow that this love, this family, would endure. My mother saw the note and smiled, her hand resting over mine, and I knew she understood. Damien's arm settled around me, his touch light but sure, and I closed my eyes, letting the warmth of his embrace wrap around me. The scent of bread lingered in the air, a reminder of the life I'd once known, now woven into the life we'd built together. I thought of the dim lights that had once felt so cold, so isolating, and how they'd come to mean something else entirely. Moments of confession, of redemption, of love. This was happiness, the kind that sinks into your bones, the kind that lasts through the years, through the storms, through the shadows. As the sun rose higher, bathing the kitchen in light, I knew that this was our eternal warmth, a love forged through sacrifice, a family rebuilt through forgiveness, a future we'd face together. My mother's laughter, soft and melodic, filled the air, and I felt Damien's hand tighten around mine, a silent vow that echoed the note I'd written. We had come through the darkness, and now, in this moment, we were home. If this journey of love, family, and redemption touched your heart, please give it a thumbs up. It means the world to us. And if you'd like to join us for more stories that warm the soul and inspire the spirit, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for being here with us, and we'll see you in the next chapter of our storytelling adventure.